As if it was not enough for Yemenis to suffer the unjustified murderous Saudi war and blockade against them for the past 6 years, along came Trump using his last few remaining days in office to make things even worse. US President Donald Trump's move to designate Yemens Ansarullah movement as a foreign terrorist organization will not only disrupt peace efforts to reach a nationwide ceasefire, but also will hamper the delivery of life-saving aid in a country where fears of famine are rising thanks to Mohammed bin Salman's aerial, sea, and land blockade. Fears have grown that such a designation, which takes effect on January 19, could put both aid groups and commercial providers at risk of American legal penalties for engagement with Ansarullah, who control large swaths of Yemen, including major points of entry. Instead of responding to the drastic need for increased funding of humanitarian aid to Yemen, the Arab world's poorest country, where 80% of the population of roughly 30 million is in need of outside assistance, in large part because of Mohammed bin Salman's game of war, Trump issued a death sentence to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent people in Yemen. The war has lately turned into a disastrous quagmire for Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, especially after the ground victories of Ansarullah in the northern Ma'rib Governorate of Yemen. Now, with this designation, the prospects for a political settlement became remote, which, if not reversed, will prove to be a self-induced headache for Mohammed bin Salman. The designation takes effect a day before the inauguration of US President-elect Joe Biden. While he had already promised to undo or reverse many of the current administration's foreign policy actions, Biden's intentions regarding the Ansarullah designation are still unclear. However, if he takes his time in looking into this matter when taking office, it could spell death for millions of innocent Yemenis. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. Last days as US President, Donald Trump moved to designate Yemen's Ansarullah movement as a foreign terrorist organization in no apparent reason except to disrupt peace efforts in the war-torn country. This move hinders the United Nations' efforts in restarting political talks to end the Saudi-led war on Yemen. The most serious implication for this designation is the legal impediments it could create for including Ansarullah in any future talks. To discuss this issue with us from Sydney is Jay Tharapel, member of the Yemen Solidarity Council. Thank you for being with us, Jay. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced on January 10th that the State Department will notify Congress that it has an intention to designate Ansarullah as a foreign terrorist organization. But when on earth did Ansarullah ever engage with the US or even threaten US interest anywhere?
Never. Ansarullah does not have a global agenda. They are a national resistance movement with an ideology that draws on Arab nationalism, and the ranks of their movement are comprised entirely of Yemenis. Meanwhile, according to the United States, Al-Qaeda and ISIS do have a global agenda. They have attacked the United States, and yet in Yemen, the US is on the same side as Al-Qaeda, which they admitted 2 years ago, which is why the Associated Press wrote an article that admitted that Al-Qaeda militants are effectively on the same side as the United States. That's a direct quote. The fact is that there are many in the US military that favor the Ansarullah movement in Yemen, but their voices have been completely sidelined. Again, these are not my views. These are the views of people who are close to the US military. So to quote Michael Horton from 2015, many officials at the US Special Operations Command, quote, favor the Houthis as they have been successful in rolling back Al-Qaeda. Horton then asked the question, why are we fighting a movement that's fighting Al-Qaeda? Now, these are good questions, and they're not coming from Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi. They're coming from those closest to the US military. Unfortunately, there is widespread ignorance in the West about Islamic movements and this tendency to assume that they're all the same simply because they have guns and they scream Allahu Akbar. I mean, we have to differentiate between globalists and nationalists among Islamic movements around the world. I mean, on the one hand, you have Al-Qaeda. It's a globalist militia. It draws on recruits from all over the world. And then you have Ansarullah. They're a nationalist movement, and they're comprised entirely of Yemenis. Their interests are confined to Yemen and the Arab world. So to answer your question, they pose no threat to the US whatsoever.
Well, if only the Americans knew that Allahu Akbar literally means hallelujah. But the US blacklisting follows a series of victories of Ansarullah, especially in the northern part of Yemen in Ma'rib province. The Saudiled coalition has lost a lot of land. They actually lost everything in the north. Do you think that this step will affect the performance of Ansarullah militarily?
Ansarullah is the most resilient national resistance movement in the world. So much punishment has been inflicted upon them, and yet they keep taking back territories, as you mentioned, and defeating the Saudi-backed mercenaries. Having said that, the US blacklisting will certainly hurt Ansarullah by punishing its base of support in those parts of Yemen that it controls, which includes roughly 80% of Yemen's population, and that appears to be the intention. So I think if Mike Pompeo were truly honest, he'd respond by saying, yes, that is the point. US officials have warned that this designation, quote, will be a not US officials, UN officials have said this. They've said that this designation will be a death sentence to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of innocent people. Sure. 29 aid agencies have written to the US Congress expressing their concerns about this designation. And in their letter, they point out that Ansarullah are not some niche armed group with small amounts of control. They have control over 1/3 of Yemen's territory, where 80% of Yemen's population live. They are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. And that's going to be hamstrung because of these designations. And therefore, this entire war is about punishing the people of Yemen for rejecting a puppet government. Everything that comes out of Pompeo's mouth makes sense only in that context.
Well, the material support restrictions which you spoke about could create serious obstacles for outside mediators, especially those who are involved in the peace process, the ongoing attempt of peace talks between Ansarullah and other parties by making those parties involved maybe making them face criminal offense to provide maybe any property or even any services to anyone affiliated even with Ansarullah, including here we're talking about expert advice and assistance. Now, is this maybe the end, in your opinion, is it the end of any possible future peace talks between Yemen and anyone else?
Not so much, and that's because peace talks are still possible. They're still possible because, according to the US State Department, there are prescribed terrorist organizations on both sides now, regardless of whether you agree with them. So if an outside mediator objects to Ansarullah on the grounds that the US considers them to be terrorists, then they're only aiding the so-called Hadi government, which recruits directly from Al-Qaeda, which is also prescribed by the US as a terrorist organization. And on top of that, Saudi Arabia supports the so-called Hadi government, which includes the Islah Party, which the Saudis themselves consider a terrorist organization because it's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So when you have people accusing their allies of being terrorists, why should an outside mediator take the label seriously, especially when it's coming from an outgoing administration? Furthermore, this designation speaks volumes about the divisions between, on the one hand, you have the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council, and on the other hand, you have the Saudi-backed Hadi government, which I talked about on your show the last time I was here. Yeah. Your audience would be interested to know that Pompeo issued his statement declaring Ansarullah a terrorist organization on January the 10th, which he justified by claiming that Ansarullah was responsible for the attacks carried out at Aden Airport on December 30th. Exactly. Now, no evidence has been presented suggesting that Ansarullah was involved. The deputy foreign minister of the Ansarullah-backed government in Sana'a, his name's Hossein al-Ezi, he condemned the attack and he blamed it on both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. On top of that, Saudi-backed and UAE-backed forces in Yemen are accusing each other of being responsible for the attacks on Aden Airport. The Southern Transitional Council has accused the Islah Party within the Hadi government of being behind the attacks. And I've seen reports from 2 pro-Hadi newspapers in Aden that are accusing the UAE's military attaché of being involved in the attacks. And there have been sources from within the Aden airport staff accusing the Southern Transitional Council of confiscating the airport's surveillance hardware. So my broader point is that in Aden, where the attacks happened, the accusations are flying between the Hadi government, the so-called Hadi government, and the Southern Transitional Council. But to the international media, on the same day that the attack took place, the Hadi government foreign minister blamed Ansarullah without providing any evidence, and therefore any investigation that has taken place without any evidence, and that is before any investigation had taken place. So even the former media advisor to the Hadi government, his name's Anis Mansour, he accused both the UAE and Saudi Arabia of erasing the crime scene before any investigations could be carried out. 10 days later, Mike Pompeo justified blacklisting Ansarullah on the grounds that they were responsible for these attacks. In other words, it's entirely possible that this attack was staged to justify blacklisting the Ansarullah movement. So to answer your question,
just 9 days before Pompeo hits the street.
Yeah, that's right. And it's an outgoing administration as well.
Basically, so instead of actually bringing peace to this war-torn country, the U.S. just broke off any back-channel talks between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, for that matter, if it were to happen, to reach a nationwide ceasefire. If the US's move was aimed at pushing Ansarullah away from what they call is the Iranian influence or the Iranian axis, what do you think will happen now?
Well, let's judge what the US is thinking by the consequences of their actions. Every ship that delivers anything to Yemen is already extensively searched for weapons, and they're specifically looking for Iranian weapons. Now, there's the possibility that aid agencies could be prosecuted by the US government for simply sending aid to the starving people of Yemen, simply because the government in Sana'a is aligned with Ansarullah. Therefore, the only logical conclusion to be drawn from the blacklisting of Ansarullah is that the only strategy that the US-Saudi alliance have is the weaponization of mass starvation against the Yemeni people. But as I mentioned earlier, the US is allied with Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which perhaps explains why 2 days after blacklisting Ansarullah, Pompeo announced that Iran and Al-Qaeda had formed this so-called
He's just
axis.
throwing accusations left and right. Yeah. And to be honest with you, what you're saying is just 101 colonialism, and I wish we had more time, but I promise that we will talk more about this in upcoming episodes. I want to thank you very much, Jay Therapel, member of the Yemen Solidarity Council, for joining us from Sydney at such a late hour. I want to thank you very much, Jay, and now please stay tuned because we will keep talking about this, especially about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen in the upcoming segment. National human rights bodies have warned last week about how the Trump administration's designation of the Ansarullah group in Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization would threaten humanitarian aid on which millions of Yemenis rely for survival. As if the current death toll wasn't enough with such designation, the US will just risk complicity in hundreds of thousands of preventable civilian deaths inside of Yemen. The world's worst humanitarian crisis in this following report. International community lawmakers, along with several government officials across the world, have denounced a rushed decision by the outgoing US administration to designate Yemen's Ansarullah movement a foreign terrorist organization, emphasizing that the move will exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in the war-torn state. On January 10, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defied warnings from humanitarian groups and announced the blacklisting of Ansarullah. The designation is set to come into force on January 19, the eve of the inauguration of U.S. President-elect Joe Biden, whose aides had previously hoped to mount a fresh push to end the U.S.-backed Saudi war on Yemen. Trump's decision will freeze any U.S.-related assets of Ansarullah, despite the latter having nothing of that sort on U.S. soil. It will also ban American citizens from doing business with them and makes it a crime to provide support or resources to the movement, even if it were humanitarian support. Warning that Yemen could be consumed by a large-scale famine, top relief officials at the United Nations implored the United States last week to scrap its blacklisting of Yemen's Ansarullah movement, arguing that the move could effectively sever food deliveries in a country where millions already face the threat of starvation due to Saudi Arabia's inhumane blockade. Aid agencies worry their work would be criminalized. Ansarullah are the legitimate elected authority in the north, and humanitarian organizations have to get permits to carry out aid programs, as well as work with ministries and local financial systems. The designation, with the increased burdens on banks' compliance mechanisms, could also impact Yemenis' access to financial systems and remittances from abroad, as well as complicating imports and raising goods prices further. The almost 6-year Saudi-led war on Yemen has left 80% of the population reliant on aid and millions on the verge of starvation. With a funding shortage this year, the United Nations had already warned that Yemen is facing what could be the world's biggest famine in decades. And what does the United States of America choose to do for that matter? Unsurprisingly, sentence millions of Yemenis to death by starvation by blacklisting the largest political bloc in the country. Now, to discuss the effects of this designation with us from Malmo is Mr. Firas Ali, who is a political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Firas. Now, Yemenis, they're not going hungry, they are being starved here. Such designation would lead to exacerbating an already shocking level of hunger in Yemen because, hint, Ansarullah are Yemenis. They are residing in Yemeni cities and villages. Hence, international aid in the form of both food and medicine will be banned from getting into those areas. What options do you think now Yemenis have left in the event Trump actually goes on and bans any form of aid to go to these Yemenis?
Well, this ban will probably further worsen the humanitarian situation in Yemen if it goes into effect. And it comes at a time when Yemen is facing war, starvation, and the coronavirus. The ban will also further expose the subhuman nature of the American administration. Nevertheless, I think the Yemeni people has no other option than to resist the US-Saudi war. And if they restrain themselves from further escalation for the moment being, then with this ban going into effect, the reason for restraining themselves will decline. The Yemeni people is a strong and proud people that won't let this ban to drag them down. What the war has not accomplished for 6 years, the ban won't do either. Of course, the suffering will increase, but again, they're facing a barbaric and inhuman war by cold-hearted leaders, so what to expect?
Well, Firas, fears have grown that such a designation, which takes effect on January 19, that's just one day before Trump leaves office. That's how evil that human is. So this designation would put both aid groups and commercial providers at risk of American legal penalties for simply engaging with Ansarullah or even anyone affiliated with them. We need to remind that they control large swaths of Yemen. We're not talking about the small group, we're talking about more than 80% of the population. I mean, what prevents the international community here from identifying this form of ban as illegal and simply ignore it?
Well, one obstacle is the international financial system, which one way or other is connected to the US dollar and to the US financial system. And therefore, the US sanctions have a huge effect on that system. The other problem is that these international organizations and the Western international community don't dare to challenge and defy US sanctions. I mean, look at the UN. The UN is incapable of doing anything against the US. It couldn't even stop the war on Iraq, so I don't expect them to do anything about this issue either. Even if one single individual in this international Western community disagrees, they don't dare to do anything. That's if they have or sit in a position to do anything, other than maybe uttering some useless words. Because their jobs and personal life are Americanized, especially in the Western world. Their economy in their home country are dependent on U.S. financial system, and that could cause harm to their personal economy, which could be targeted, and thus they're not ready to take that step. And that's regard individuals and not Western government who simply always mimic U.S. politics, despite what they show openly. Look at the American withdrawal from the JCPOA, for example. Despite portraying an open disagreement with Trump, in reality, they didn't do any business with Iran. I'm referring to the European governments. So international institutions and Western countries don't even dare condemning acts of terror like the assassination of Iranian scientists back in November. So I don't expect so much from them, actually.
Well, the designation takes effect, as we said, a day before the inauguration of U.S. President-elect Joe Biden, while he promised before to undo or at least reverse many of the current administration's foreign policy actions. But Biden's intentions regarding the Ansarullah designation are still very vague. They're not clear. Do you think that the humanitarian situation in Yemen could be maybe an enough drive for Biden to do something about it, to change, reverse, even at least stop the support for Saudi Arabia?
Well, Marwa, firstly, we have to remember that the war on Yemen started during Biden's watch as a vice president.
Exactly.
It was the It was the Obama administration that gave green light and support for the war from day one. So Biden doesn't have a clean record when it comes to the war in Yemen. But again, Biden wants to portray himself as opposite to Trump, and his time in office as a president could be a good excuse to stop the war, because the Saudis will never win this war. It has been very obvious since day one, and we are in the 6th year of the war now. So if something will reverse the decision or stop the war, it won't be the humanitarian situation. It will be the economic hardships that the Saudis are burdened with, and or the need to portray a good image of the new US administration. Because in the end of the day, the US has never bothered to care about humanitarian situations of other nations, except that of Israel, regardless of what the name of the president was at the time being. The Saudi war in
Yemen, as you said, it turned into a disastrous quagmire for Saudi de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has been a strong ally of the Trump administration. We still don't know if he's going to fail to build that much of a strong relationship with the Biden administration as well. However, Biden's foreign policy on the region of West Asia still remains a blank page for now. He hasn't really spoken about that a lot, even in the campaigning time. He didn't really talk a lot about what they call the Middle East. What do you think Mohammed bin Salman is capable of offering to the Biden administration, maybe to keep them a bit away from Yemen?
Well, I don't think MBS Mohammed bin Salman could offer Biden anything that he didn't offer Trump already. And yet the situation of the Saudis in the world changed to the worse. He would probably offer, if he would offer something, the same thing the Saudis always offer the Americans, the only thing they could offer the Americans, and that's money. But you can't buy time forever, regardless of the size of your oil well. I think that Biden administration would keep their historical American ties to the Saudis, but the support for the war will weaken for already mentioned reasons. The Saudis are stubborn and wait for a golden opportunity to escape the war, while they try to keep their pride intact. Either that will happen soon, or an escalation by the Yemeni people will force them to retreat. The Yemeni people are truly suffering, Marwa, but they have been very restrained in attacking goals inside Saudi Arabia, except that to Aramco. And all these years of fighting have given the Yemeni people good experience, and Ansarullah is a movement now which has evolved from a local movement in Yemen 6 years ago to a huge force that even Israel takes into consideration regarding its national security. And that says a lot. Exactly. And I want to finish with what the Yemeni Foreign Minister Hisham Sharaf Abdullah recently said to Yemeni media. He said, "Those who mobilize their militants towards Yemen with the goal of causing death and destroying its cities and villages cannot expect us to respond by waving at them and sending them flowers and peace doves.
It is basically the same speech, definitely the same speech given by every resistance in the region of West Asia against every occupying power and colonizing power that ever tried and dared to make the people, the natives, submissive to the wills of the Western colonial powers. Thank you very much, Firas Ali, for speaking with us, discussing with us the humanitarian crisis in Yemen from Malmo. Thank you very much for being with us, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.